Ever since the announcement was made that the Indian football team would be taking part in the 2023 Asian Games, well, there was a lot of celebration initially, but since the time that announcement has made, well, there's only been chaos, there's been confusion, there have been changes, there's even been a hostage-like situation for some of the players. And if that sounds confusing, worry not, we'll get to what exactly we meant by that a little later in this video. But what we do know now, a big update, is that India will in fact be without the services of Sunil Chhetri, Sandesh Jhingan and Gurpreet Singh Sadhu, the three players who were above the age of 23 that India had named in their squad and had very confidently said that they will be available throughout the tournament. Turns out they're not really going to be there. So how exactly did we get here? Well, it's an interesting story and one that involves a lot of toing and froing between the AIFF, the federation that governs the sport in the nation, and the Indian Super League and their partners, Football Sports Development Limited. Now, it does also really come and bring into light that, truth be told, it did seem like a rash decision that was made without the consultation of all the stakeholders. And what we saw play out in front of us was something of a civil war between the team, or rather the federation that controls national interest, versus the company that runs the league and will obviously be looking out for their own interests. The real losers here were the fans, and why that exactly is the case, I'll get to in just a bit. But first off, let's look at how it is that we got here and what exactly it is that has been going on ever since. Now, what we know is that the three players who are above the age of 23, remember the Asian Games is in essence an under 23 tournament, and therefore you are allowed, or your squad has to be mostly that age, but you're allowed three players beyond that. But the three players who were named in that squad initially, that is of course Chhetri, Sandesh Jhingan and Gurpreet Singh Sadhu, will no longer be a part of that squad. In fact, the Asian Games squad is going to undergo some massive rehauls and changes, because without these three players, you're going to be sending a predominantly under 23 squad, because even players who you had earmarked as backups of sorts will not be taking part in that tournament, who come under or over the age of 23. And it's a big loss for the AIFF, but it is a massive win for the ISL, because truth be told, whatever it is you think of their decisions, they were well within their rights to actually refuse to release the players, because the rule is such that unless it is a FIFA or AFC window international game, clubs are not mandated to release players. The Asian Games doesn't take place within the FIFA window, which means that it's not a tournament that is necessarily, comes under FIFA governance, although that is true that every football would come under that. But when you're talking about FIFA windows, it would mean games that will directly correlate to either the FIFA World Cup or any team's Continental Cup. The Asian Games doesn't come under either of those, so the clubs were in no, let's say, they were well within their rights to stand their ground and say that we will not be releasing these players. And this isn't a problem unique to India. It happens abroad even, wherein clubs will just simply choose not to release their top talent for under 19, under 17, under 23, under 21 tournaments, because they are allowed to, unless the clubs can be convinced that there's a good reason that they should be losing out on a particular player. You're not going to see it happen. And that exactly is what's happened here, which is why there's been so much of a reject. Not that the AIFF didn't apparently try their best to convince players, even going as far as to involve certain players, 9 of them really, in what was something like a hostage situation. Sounds confusing? Well, the thing is, and we'll give you a bit of a background before we get into the details of it, is that the Indian football team had recently been in Thailand for the Kings Cup. Now, of course, it was a bit of a disappointing Kings Cup campaign, because India lost both their matches, and many people thought that India would have actually stood a good chance to win the trophy. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But the players who were supposed to return home right after, well, there was a certain section of them that didn't end up returning, and that is because the AIFF were trying very hard to convince the ISL sides to let those players stay with the Indian team. And they had held plenty of talks talking about the national interest and prioritizing that over the ISL. And therefore, these players were in Thailand when those talks were taking place. And when I say it was a hostage situation of sorts, I meant that, well, these players were actually kept there because there was and instead of being sent back, because some of them were sent back, the ones who were supposed to be part of the Asian Games squad were not sent back because the AIFF were trying very hard to convince the ISL clubs to let these players stay with them and then thereafter travel to China, where of course the Asian Games will be taking place. However, it wasn't really, let's say the optics of it weren't really good, because it did feel like the players were being held back almost against their will. Although the AIFF's, let's say, tale of how things went down is just a little bit different, although they did pretty much admit that they had actually kept these players back with the hopes of ensuring that they were retained for the Asian Games. Because this is what Shaji Prabhakaran, who is the Secretary General of the AIFF, had to say when he was quizzed about this. He said that we'd booked one-way tickets for the Asian Games bound players. The plan was to get these players to continue training in Thailand, then head to China for the Asian Games. So in essence, there were 9 players who were only given one-way tickets, because the plan was that they would stay back in Thailand, then instead of heading back home, they'd head out to China, Guangzhou, where of course the Asian Games will be taking place, so that they could be training. The key is that actually they had no consent from the ISL clubs, which means that one extra day was actually 1 day longer than the AIFF was allowing to keep these players. Eventually, of course, the ISL clubs refused to play ball. They played hardball and said that, look, we're not releasing these players, so please send them back. And that is exactly what happened. Monday was the day when they were supposed to return. These 9 players ended up returning back home on a Tuesday. But again, as I said, it's not a very good look that you have to be keeping the players like this and keeping them uncertain about what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Remember, the ISL will be getting underway from September 21st, so these have to be with their clubs, because again, they would be in the midst of their final preparations for the new season, and keeping them like that was hardly ideal under any circumstances whatsoever. And in fact, what this has done is basically forced the AIFF to change things up on the fly, which is why you will be seeing a very new squad taking part in the Asian Games. In fact, what is essentially being done now is that from all the players who will be in the squad, they can't take more than 2 players from one particular ISL club. That was pretty much something that was confirmed by an AIFF official anonymously. He said that the plan is now to take just 2 players from each ISL team. We do not want to put any club at a disadvantage since the ISL will be in progress. But it does actually expose really the shoddy manner in which this entire thing has been done. And truth be told, there are a few questions that still remain unanswered. Questions that we will be posing now. And although it is worth noting that there's every chance that these questions will not be answered. What are those questions, I hear you ask? Well, here we are. First off, why exactly were the stakeholders or all the stakeholders of Indian football not taken into consideration when the call was made to eventually allow the allow the Indian football team to actually take part in the Asian Games? The ISL and everything else had been planned keeping in mind that these players would not in fact be released for the Asian Games, but you took that call and then simply expected the ISL clubs to play ball in the name of national interest, when truth be told, they were well within their rights to not release these players. You then made multiple appeals, essentially held players hostage for a day extra in a foreign country, all the while trying to convince these clubs to release the players, which they still refused to do. And when they finally chose not to relent, you then said that, okay, we're going to only take 2 players at most from every club because we don't want to disrupt the season. It does seem like a very, very shoddily planned, poorly executed matter. And truth be told, when the Indian football team was actually allowed to take part in the Asian Games, most people thought that these were things that would have actually been sorted out behind the scenes. As it turns out, getting the approval was just the start, but the process since then has been anything but smooth. And you know who the biggest losers in all of this are? Indian football fans would have been wanting to cheer a strong squad going to the Asian Games. That really is the major problem when you're looking at things, because most fans would have expected that if they had even a relatively strong squad going to the Asian Games, it would be good preparation for the upcoming AFC Asian Cup, which will take place in December and January. Unfortunately, you're sending what is in essence a second string team, and India are not even one of the stronger teams in Asia, meaning it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be getting anything from this particular tournament, except of course some much needed game time in national team colors for some of these players. Is all of that worth it though? Doesn't really seem like it to me, because again, as I said, I'm all for the players going and playing in the Asian Games, but all of this could and should have been planned so much better. In fact, many would argue that this has been probably one of the worst executed, let's say, issues when it comes down to planning out how it is the team should be participating in a tournament, or rather in a multi-nation event like the Asian Games, and it doesn't really paint the Indian football team, the AIFF and India as a whole in a good light. Of course, that's just my opinion on things. What do you guys feel? You can let us know that in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel and tap that bell icon as well. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, and don't forget to download the AajTak app. Plus, if you're already on the channel, go right ahead and check out some other videos we've done. For now though, from my side, it is bye-bye.